We're moving on to Mind, and I'm going to just introduce Virginia, the moderator, and then I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves. But Virginia is a student at Antioch University in LA, pursuing her license in marriage and family therapy. She's been a crisis counselor for 8 years, working as the head of outreach for Teen Line Youth, and works as a midwife's assistant. And Virginia is on the AIM Youth Advisory Board as well.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's lovely to see everybody this Saturday. So this is kind of the long-awaited psychedelics panel. People are really excited to hear about this very quickly changing and very exciting topic in the mental health community. So I'm going to pass it to Dr. Grob first. I would love for all of the panelists to give us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you work, what work you are currently pursuing, and maybe a little bit about why you started, and then take it away from there.
Okay, great. Thank you. No longer than less than that. Thank you.
Is that working here?
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Charlie Grob. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center for 29 and a half years. When I arrived there in 1993, I thought I'd stay for a year or two, and that's stretched out over almost 30 years. And one reason why I've stayed, besides the very, very collegial, supportive environment and the mission we all share of serving the underserved at Harbor, is that I've been able to do a lot of research with psychedelics, which was always my dream. In fact, back in the early 70s, when I was kind of looking for some direction and had dropped out of college, one night I had an epiphany, which I felt compelled to share with my father. And I said, Dad, I want to study psychedelics. They're fascinating. There's so much we could learn about the brain, mind-brain interface. There's these remarkable treatment models. And he heard me out. He said, well, son, there may be something to what you say, but no one will listen to you unless you get your credentials. And boom, I knew I had to go back to school, which I did not want to do, but I did it, and that vision never left me of wanting to study psychedelics. I read everything I could, and eventually got into the situation where it was feasible. So the studies I've done are, I did the first phase 1 MDMA study in normal volunteers looking at the range of physiological and psychological responses. Shortly after that, I did the first of a series of ayahuasca studies in Brazil. We were invited down by a syncretic religion that had permission from the government to use ayahuasca within religious ceremony. So we did some fairly extensive work in Manaus, in Amazonia, under challenging conditions. I had great colleagues, including Dennis McKenna, Terrence McKenna's younger brother. Some of you may be aware of the McKennas. And we came back with great data. Years later, I was invited back by the Brazilian judiciary to examine how ayahuasca has impacted the adolescence of families in the UDV. From having used ayahuasca. And we did a very elaborate study with, I think we had 40 ayahuasca-exposed adolescents, 40 non-exposed matched controls, and found these kids were very, very high functioning. Some of them had actually been exposed in utero. Mothers participated in ceremony during pregnancy. They were baptized as babies with an eyedropper, just a drop on the tongue, and then they did not have any exposure until they hit puberty. So we got some good data there. Another study I've done is we did the pilot psilocybin treatment of advanced cancer anxiety. We got very good data, and 2 programs on the East Coast at Hopkins and at NYU replicated our study. NYU used our protocol. Hopkins had their somewhat different protocol, but they both found very, very positive outcomes in regards to amelioration of of overwhelming existential anxiety and depression. We've now embarked on putting together a new multi-site study looking at the use of a psilocybin treatment model in individuals who are approaching the end of life and who are severely demoralized. So we're excited. Probably will start in the spring sometime. I also did a study with my colleague Alicia Danforth at Harbor looking at young adults on the autism spectrum who had severe incapacitating social anxiety using a placebo-controlled double-blind study where MDMA was the active drug, again, finding a very, very strong drug effect. So I've been able to, all this was done on, a lot of this was done on weekends because I had my day job as well. But that being the case, I feel I was able to accomplish a fair amount, but also very importantly, in the last few years, this field has taken off. For many years, it felt like the field consisted of myself and a few friends, but since the Michael Pollan book came out several years ago, that's had an enormous impact on raising awareness and raising the interest of other investigators to study these fascinating drugs which were neglected for several decades. After the raucous, tumultuous 60s, it was pretty much entirely put to rest until the early 90s when our study got permission, Strasman's study at New Mexico got permission to work with DMT, Deborah Mash at Miami got permission to work with Ibogaine, and that kind of launched the first phase of the resurgence. But really recently, it's become extremely a topic of extreme interest. The residents at my hospital and at UCLA, where I've been spending more time, more and more are interested in some level of getting involved. I should also mention that UCLA has just established a formal research, basically a psychedelic studies initiative to help, basically to create an infrastructure that could facilitate research for psychedelics on the UCLA campus in Westwood and at the UCLA-affiliated hospitals, including our hospital at Harbor, where we have access to, we're kind of very community-oriented. And one area that has not received a whole lot of attention is treating subjects who come from low, middle socioeconomic strata. Usually subjects are middle class to upper middle class, so we need to look at all strata of society. So the field is getting very active. It's important that they're conducted impeccably. I wrote an editorial for the British journal Lancet a couple of years ago with a couple of colleagues that addressed how imperative it is that safety parameters and ethical parameters be rigorously adhered to. That has not always been the case. If you're interested, New York Magazine has a podcast called Cover Story that address some very worrisome ethical issues that have come to light, and that cannot be allowed to happen any longer. The field basically has to police itself. So there won't be FDA monitors at ayahuasca sessions. It's the field needs a mechanism to identify what should not be happening, and then somehow or other make sure that doesn't continue to happen, because people do get injured. This treatment model, it's an entirely new paradigm in psychiatry, and I've been on the one hand a mainstream psychiatrist for 40 years. On the other hand, we need a new paradigm. We need a new treatment model, and there may very well be something here. The investigators in the 50s and 60s felt that was definitely the case. But by the late 60s, there was so much cultural turmoil and political divisiveness that it all fell apart, and nothing was allowed to proceed for decades. Now we have a golden opportunity. We just can't mess it up. We've got to just use the just strong protective factors and good research methodologies and accurate collection of and analysis of data. So we might be on the threshold of a whole new era in terms of treatment, or we may just start repeating the mistakes of the past. We'll have to see. Some studies recently that have been reported, which are very encouraging, first and foremost includes a study at NYU, reaffirming what was identified in the going back to the 50s and 60s, that a psychedelic research model might be highly efficacious for the treatment of alcohol abuse disorder, one of the most difficult areas in all in medicine still to treat. And so Michael Bogenschutz at NYU presented very, very strong data with that population. And also, I'll tell you, for the first time in 50 years, NIH is now beginning, very tentatively, very cautiously, but they're beginning to fund psychedelic treatment studies, which has not happened since the 60s. They're funding a severe psilocybin treatment of severe refractory obsessive compulsive disorder study at Yale, and NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, is treating a follow-up to the Johns Hopkins study of using a psilocybin treatment model for cigarette addiction. Their pilot work showed great promise. There hasn't been any follow-up because funding was very scarce, and that's always been a rate-limiting factor. But things are starting to take off in a good way. On the worrisome side, there's now and this took me by surprise, the advent of commercial interests, let's say, who want to kind of move into the psychedelic treatment world, take out patents and exclude other investigators and treatment providers, and that's potentially very, very problematic. There are all sorts of ethical issues raised, all sorts of practical issues, and I've started to speak up about that, as have some others, but there's a lot of money being poured in by individuals who are already exceedingly wealthy, who want to simply add to their wealth. So, extracting profit from this area is going to take away from establishing the strongest safety parameters and will limit, I think, the scope of the field. So stay tuned. We're still in an early chapter, but I think this is a very fascinating area, rich with potential, and the next generations are, you guys are going to be, we're going to be passing the torch on to you. We took it from the older guys. We're now the older guys. We're going to pass it on. And important, if you're interested in this area, just to do your due diligence, learn as much as you can, and keep in your mind, first and foremost, safety and ethics. Without safety and ethics, everything will unravel. So that's my brief talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grob. So
I go back to being the next man.
There's the science of it. There's lots of it. Probably quite a few words I didn't know, so here we go. I'm learning as well. So Dr. Tripp actually was my professor a couple of years ago. My sophomore year of college, I was startled to find I was taking a class on psychedelics, which just about scared the bejesus out of me, because it's a frightening topic for people who don't know anything about it. And I am so appreciative of Dr. Tripp's sort of discourse around this topic, and I'm really thrilled to hear what he has to say about where we're at with the discourse and what we can expect in the mental health world as well as elsewhere on this topic. So Dr. Tripp, you want to take it away?
Sure. Oh, it's on. Okay. Well, first I have to dispense with, yes, my name is Dr. Tripp, and I do. So I'm sort of destined to do this, I guess. Charlie gave a great overview of so much that's going on in terms of research and some of the questions and ethics and cautions. I'm not a researcher. My background is in humanities and a little bit in social science. So I approach all of this from a different kind of perspective. When I'm working with students like Virginia, when she took a course of mine on psychedelics, what I'm trying to get people to do is to think critically about psychedelics. They're powerful substances, and people get caught up in these experiences. They become new believers, and all sorts of stuff goes on, and which is great, absolutely great, but also, to be able to think critically about your experiences and about this emerging field. I think of the emerging field as sort of a psychedelic industrial complex that's emerging. You may have heard those words around the military industrial complex in the past, but I think something similar is emerging now. It does raise a lot of questions. Who has access is a huge issue. And that most of, not all, but most of the research and writing around psychedelics has been done by people who look a lot like me. So they've been men, they've been white, they've been middle class, they've been straight. And there's all sorts of perspectives around psychedelics that just have not yet been included. They don't have a seat at the table. So those are the kinds of ethical issues that I'm interested in the work that I do. In addition to that, I've been underground sitter, guide, along with my partner who's here, for years. And so I bring that sort of practitioner's perspective that isn't a legitimate practitioner, right? So I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not even a therapist, but I think that there's an important tradition there. And while I agree with Charlie that, when everything got closed down officially in the late 60s, early 70s, around research in this area, it continued. It just continued underground. And practice and practitioners and methodologies and all of these things continued. So that's more of the perspective that I'm going to bring to today.
Okay, and Wesley, hi.
Hi, I'm freezing bronze. I'm cold. My name's Wesley. I think I'm sitting underneath an AC vent, but I'm cold, right? Okay, hi. Okay, so my name's Wesley Christensen. I am the host of a podcast called Wake Up with Wesley. Okay, I guess I'm a mom. I'm a mom to 3 kids. I have a freshman in high school, which is wild to me, all the way down to a 2nd grader. And I think what's applicable here, I'm like sitting next to big brains, but I just do this stuff. So I think what's applicable is my story as to how I got into this work. And it starts about 10 years ago, so I was at my very own personal rock bottom. I didn't know a human being could get as low as I found myself at the age of like 26. So you want to hear it? Let's go. So I had just had my 3rd baby. I was in the throes of crippling postpartum depression, which kind of, it like would swerve in and out of body dysmorphic disorder, which I didn't know that was what it was at the time. And it was with my face, it wasn't with my body. I would look in the mirror and I would see a melting face, a guy from Beetlejuice, it would shapeshift. It was the oddest thing in the world. I didn't tell anyone what was going on because I thought that they would take my kids away. So I didn't even tell my husband. So I was dealing with that, and all of these things happened in succession within a span of 3 weeks. So I'm going through that. I have a newborn. My husband's business partnership, it dissolved. And I have consent from my lovely husband to share all this, just so we all know it's clear. But we found ourselves homeless, penniless, with 3 kids to care for. And Bronson, my husband at the time, he developed an addiction to his prescription not pain meds, it was ADHD meds and Xanax. And it had been a problem for about a year at that point until he finally accidentally overdosed in the car one night. I saw it happen, I was there, and I thought he died. I thought he was having a stroke, I thought he died. That spurred on a separation between us. I moved in with my family, and he moved to California. So I was dealing with this really heavy stuff, didn't have a job, didn't know if he would even live. and with 3 very, very, very young kids, and we had about $300 to our name. So this is the part of this psychedelic field that it's immeasurable. I don't know how you do the scientific research on this, but this is what happened. It's true. Someone called us when they heard about what was going on with my husband, and they were like, you have got to take your husband to Africa. There is this plant. It's called iboga. It will cure him in a day. And I'm sitting there, and something I left out was I was Mormon. So I'm uncomfortable with coffee. I'm uncomfortable with drinking. I'm uncomfortable with all drugs. And this guy had the bright idea to be like, hey, let's go take a drug to fix a drug problem. And I hung up on him. I was like, this is some bullshit. Really, honestly. That night, this is the mystical, this is the magical, this is the undescribable. But I had a dream, and I'm not a person who dreams, where I'm sitting on a beach, there's a jungle behind me, and I hear on a loudspeaker the words ayahuasca repeatedly. It was kind of freaky. I woke up, I remember this dream, which it doesn't happen to me. A few days later, I'm nursing my son. The same word plays out in my head on a loudspeaker, ayahuasca. It was so trippy, it was so freaky. I grab a laptop, I'm typing in ayahuasca, I'm spelling it like Iowa. I-O-W-A, I've never heard of this. This is a decade ago, you guys. This is not online, this is not talked about. And my life changes fundamentally from that point forward. I dove into this work slowly, methodically, I believe really responsibly. In the way that I've seen people approach it now, it's like I was doing my research, my due diligence, I was doing my prep work. So I've done many, many, many ayahuasca ceremonies. I've done psilocybin journeys. I've done it all. The only things I haven't done are DMT and iboga. So it is now my life's work, my life's passion. It's changed me so fundamentally, and I actually call people out when they say it's changed them, because this is what I found. I don't believe that I'm changed, I'm a different person. I believe that the work that I have done with plants has restored me to who I was born as. I get to live really authentically, really embodied. I believe in these plants. I believe the impact, the positive impact that they can have on our community, on our children, on our lives, when used ethically, responsibly, and with proper support and integration and reverence. That's kind of where I live in camp, and I've now made it a career to talk about this stuff on a podcast. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
Thanks, Wesley. So I want to ask Wesley a personal question, if that's okay, and then I'd be curious kind of what the doctors kind of had to add to that. Were there any, because obviously this is a mental health conference, were there any sort of stereotypical mental health issues that were going on that you think psychedelics had a direct effect on? Depression, anxiety, stress, things like,
yes,
on a daily basis.
Yes. Well, the body dysmorphic disorder and the depression were what's kind of triggered this desire to seek these other modalities and finances. It was more cost effective to me to use these plants than to go to therapy. I didn't have health insurance, which is, a lot of us today. So, that was my avenue. But what I discovered when utilizing the plants was the body dysmorphic disorder, the depression, they were just the symptoms of a much, much deeper trauma that I had just disassociated from. Covered. I wouldn't look at those things in my past. I wouldn't even say that my childhood was filled with abuse. I could not use the word abuse until I started working with these plants. And yeah, my childhood was riddled with emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, trauma in all ways, shapes, and forms. And I think delving into this work and identifying the root cause of the depression, of the body dysmorphic disorder, that I don't know if it could have been done the way it was done without the support of these plants with the proper people involved.
Okay, so those words, proper people, I think that's really interesting. And I know that a big topic on this is integration, right? How do we integrate what can be learned from plant medicines? Because every trip can be different for every person, and I think that I know when I was in Dr. Tripp's class, we talked a lot about ego deaths, which just about put me in my grave, terrified me. And so I'm curious what you guys have to say about integrating these ideas into mental health care in the bigger picture.
Sure, I'll jump in. I appreciate your story. It resonates with my own. For most of us, I think there's a reason why we're doing this work, and I, in large measure, owe whoever I am today to intense work, especially with mushrooms for me. Dabbled in all kinds of psychedelics, but those are the ones that have been my teachers, and not something I'm going to talk about right now, because I'll just sit here and cry. So we don't want to do that. But integration is the key, in my opinion. You can partake in various psychedelic substances, have life-changing, life-altering experiences, and then some point down the road, maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, maybe it's longer, you're right back where you started. And so I don't think psychedelics in and of themselves change us. They present us with opportunities to change. And that the change comes through the work that's done. When we work with somebody and they have their psychedelic experience and they're very excited and they can't stop talking about all the amazing, okay, great. And then our response is often, so now the work actually begins. It begins after the experience. And how do you mine that experience? How do you come to language it? How do you come to incorporate it into your life? How do you take this thing that is ineffable, that's beyond language, that seems deeply connected with the infinite, and bring it here into your quotidian, everyday reality, so that you can, in the language I like to use, is that you can live a psychedelically informed life. Like what is there to garner from that experience and bring back? And then, very briefly, I think there's a number of ways to do that integrative work, and I'll just schematically outline it rather than go into detail. But one is to have a path, right? It's some sort of spiritual path. We had an excellent presentation in that previous hour about meditation. That can be an extraordinary path for integrating this work. Another type of integration is through psychological therapy. So you have a therapist or someone who's well versed in psychedelics and psychedelic experience, and you can work with them to do this integrative work. Typically, not always, probably, but typically that involves some degree of pathologization, right? So I'm here working on some sort of a problem. I've got depression, I've got anxiety, I've got PTSD. I wrestle with addiction or OCD or whatever. And then a third kind of way to do this work, which is the way that we tend to do it, is more philosophically, spiritually, philosophically, ontologically, pick a word, existentially, that's looking more at self-understanding in the context of your relationship to yourself, to the world, and to reality more broadly. And so entertaining those kinds of more philosophical questions.
Dr. Grob, do you want to add anything there? Are you good? Well, I think the last thing I want to ask is this subject can feel very personal to some people and very far from others. And if somebody were interested in kind of digging into this work, whether it be taking part in it, learning about it, helping others who are taking part in it, how would you advise them to even begin? Because I would have had no idea where to begin if a class wasn't offered to me. So if somebody were curious, where would you tell them to begin if they wanted to kind of get into this work in one way or another? And it's kind of a big question.
Well, good question. I mean, what I did was I just started going through the literature, you know, and I had access to the medical psychiatric literature, and I just, you know, devoured everything I could, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I found in particular the anthropological literature shed a great deal of light on how these compounds have been used traditionally over vast periods of time, and these proper safeguards that were learned by indigenous people going back in time.
So getting into the research.
Yeah, that was my approach. But also practically speaking, I think it's a matter of, well, this may not address the question, but as these guys are talking, I was thinking, you know, what's really important is to be cognizant of optimizing set and setting. Set is who you are, what are your psychological vulnerabilities, why do you want to have this experience, what is your intention? Intention is critical, and I'm of the view, you know, that intentions need to be serious. There's either an intention to have a spiritual experience, a therapeutic experience, to get insight into questions that need to be answered. Mm-hmm. If the intention is to just go party, then you could be in for a long night.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? and then, you know, setting is just optimizing where you're doing it, who you're doing it with, how safe is it, what are the proper, you know, protective factors.
So set and setting.
Thinking
about set and setting.
Set and setting.
Great.
And I'll also mention, because Dr. Tripp mentioned integration, that's a very, very important issue. And that's why, you know, in general use as well as in research settings, there needs to be provisions to provide integrative sessions or opportunities just to talk through and reflect back on why did you want to do this? Not only what did you see, what did you feel, what did you learn, but how does it square up with the original intention?
Okay, great.
And it's very helpful also after these experiences to write them down, because then it kind of fixes it in your memory, writing it down, or just talking it through with a therapist or a capable, experienced facilitator can address that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And do either of you want to add anything in before we start a Q&A?
I do. I would say that I've made psychedelic mistakes and I've had psychedelic wins. And I have kind of come up with it's not my own formula, but it's what really works for my body, and it comes down to somatics and working with a practitioner who deeply, deeply understands trauma responses and you have spent adequate time with beforehand. We talk a lot about integration, but really I'm finding the preparatory work is just as important as the integrative work. And so, like my personal formula right now is I work with someone one-on-one in energy sessions, almost like therapy, for 2 to 3 months. We get my nervous system in a place where I deeply, deeply respect this person that I'm working with, where I feel very safe, where they know my traumas, problems, intentions off the top of their head. We understand each other. I feel regulated around this person, and only then will I enter medicine space. And then after that journey is over, I have 2 to 3 months of therapy, processing with that same person. So it really is like a beginning and a middle and an end. It is not just the psychedelic journey. Everyone gets really hung up on the trip. That's not even it for me. It really is in the preparatory work and the weeks after to months after that you dive in and you process and you journal and you embody these changes that you experienced. That seems to work best for me, and in a one-on-one setting. So a lot of these retreat centers, it's like, you're in a room with 75 people, you're in a room with 15 people, they're strangers, you're meeting these people day of. And I've done that, and it's been great, but really I'm finding it's much more beneficial to have like a one-on-one relationship in these settings. That's been the most profound for me, and that's what I hope this kind of turns into. I don't know how. I have lots of questions, honestly, but I'm excited to see where it goes.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing a lot on setting for you. Like you've learned a lot about setting, what
Yes.
works for you personally.
Imperative.
Absolutely. Okay, Dr. Tripp.
Quickly throw in a couple of other things. I appreciate both of those responses. One is, in addition to set and setting, I always add dose. It's something to take into consideration.
So important.
You know, I'll run into some, oh yeah, I had my first mushroom trip, that was great. How was it? Oh yeah, I just sat around and giggled all night. Well, you know, how much do you take? I have no idea. I just ate a mushroom. And it's like, okay. Right. So dose factors into this. The other thing is, you know, there's so much going on, and there's so many ways to partake in psychedelics. And I think of psychedelics rather than psychedelic community. I talk about it as the psychedelic circus. There's a lot going on. It's a three-ring circus. And there's a lot of ways to do this. And I think most of them are valuable. I think the kid who, you know, takes a hit of LSD and goes to a concert and dances all night and in communion with others. I remember distinctly a conversation with somebody who was having exactly that experience. And they said that's the most spiritual experience for them. And it informs how they live. And that's how they do it, in rooms of thousands of people dancing all night on LSD. So there's a lot of ways to do this. But if you're working on issues, then I tend to agree with you that you know, you need to park your ass and do some serious work before and during and after. And if that's what you're interested in doing, then I would suggest finding some sort of a guide or a therapist or someone who can help you with that rather than just trying to do it on your own.
Great. Thank you guys so much for everything you've contributed. We're going to do a 15-minute break, and then we'll finish up with movement.